The Last Smile Before Death. 8 secrets buried in Hans Frank's final 11 minutes. The execution chamber at Nuremberg was meant to be swift, clinical, and final. Yet on the morning of the 16th of October, 1946, something happened that no one present would ever forget. Hans Frank, the man they once called the Butcher of Poland, climbed the wooden steps to the gallows with a faint, unsettling smile curling across his face. He was only 46, but he carried the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. When the trapdoor opened, the world expected an instant end. Instead, witnesses saw him twist and convulse for 11 agonizing minutes, suspended between life and death, as if history itself refused to release him. That image, a man who had reduced others to starvation, to gas chambers, to silence now gasping for his own breath, became one of the most haunting symbols of justice delivered. But how does a promising young lawyer, once entrusted with the law, descend into such darkness? And what kind of man could smile at the rope that awaited him? To answer that, we must go back to his childhood, his rise in Hitler's shadow, and the empire of terror he ruled in Poland. Early life. Hans Michael Frank was born on the 23rd of May 1900, in Karls, then a quiet town of the German Empire. His father, Karl, was a successful lawyer. His mother, Magdalena, the daughter of a prosperous banker. On the surface, the family looked stable, almost destined for respectability. Yet beneath that facade, young Hans's world fractured early. When he was just 10 years old, his mother abandoned the family to live with another man in Prague. For a child, that wound was devastating, a lesson in betrayal and instability that never truly healed. Growing up in Munich, Hans immersed himself in study at the Maximilians Gymnasium, driven perhaps by a desire to prove himself worthy of the family name. At 17, during the closing chapters of World War I, he enlisted in the German army. He never saw the front lines, but the collapse of Germany in 1918 scarred him deeply. Like so many of his generation, he carried the bitterness of defeat, the humiliation of surrender, and the anger at a society in ruins. When the German Revolution erupted, Frank joined paramilitary Freikorps units, bands of hardened veterans who blamed communists and traitors for the nation's fall. In their violent marches and bloody crackdowns, young Hans found both belonging and purpose. This was no longer the boy abandoned by his mother. This was the man who would begin walking down a darker road, one paved with ideology, resentment, and power. Rise in the Nazi Party. The early 1922s were a turbulent time in Germany, streets filled with protests, hunger, and the constant fear of political collapse. Amid this chaos, Hans Frank gravitated toward groups that promised order, pride, and revenge for the humiliation of Versailles. In Munich, he was drawn into the orbit of the Thule Society, an occultist circle whose ideas would inspire the founding of the German Workers' Party. By 1919, he had joined its successor, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Frank's commitment deepened in September 1923, when he enlisted with the Sturmabteilung, the SA Hitler's paramilitary brown shirts. That November, he marched beside them in the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, the failed coup intended to seize power in Munich and then Berlin. Shots rang out. 16 Nazis fell dead in the street, alongside 4 policemen. Hitler was arrested, sentenced to 5 years in prison. Frank, facing charges, fled across the border to Italy, where he learned the language of Mussolini's rising fascist state. When the charges were dropped, he returned to Munich a free man. In 1925, he married Brigitte Herbst, a stenographer with ambitions as sharp as her husband's. She saw in him a gateway to status, but their marriage was stormy, riddled with manipulation. Still, they had 5 children together, including Nicholas, who would later condemn his father's legacy. By 1929, Frank had risen from obscure radical to a man inside Hitler's inner circle. Appointed the Führer's personal legal advisor and head of the Nazi Party's legal office, he defended the party in over 2,400 cases. In courtroom after courtroom, he gave legal cover to a movement of violence, propaganda, and fear. Law, in his hands, became a weapon not to protect the innocent, but to legitimize the dreams of a dictator. Governor of Poland. September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, igniting the Second World War. Within weeks, the country was split in two, half swallowed by Hitler, half by Stalin. Out of this partition emerged a grim creation, the general government, a territory meant to serve as a dumping ground for those the Reich deemed inferior. And at its helm, Adolf Hitler placed Hans Frank. Frank received the news in Berlin with arrogance disguised as pride. Returning home, he turned to his wife with chilling words, "Brigitte, you will be the Queen of Poland." In his mind, this was no ordinary appointment. Poland, with its millions of citizens, was to be his personal colony, his empire inside the Reich. From Wawel Castle in Krakow, Frank ruled with cold detachment. He envisioned a land stripped of dignity, declaring openly that Poles should be reduced to the status of slaves. Yet even as Governor-General, his authority was constantly undermined by Heinrich Himmler and the SS. When he dared to question the construction of concentration camps, Himmler snapped, "That's none of your business." But Frank remained complicit. His administration enforced racial decrees, organized forced labor, and oversaw starvation policies designed to break the spirit of an entire people. Behind the Baroque walls of Wawel Castle, decisions were signed that condemned millions to hunger, humiliation, and deportation. His title may have been governor, but in truth, he was the face of Nazi colonial terror, a man who cloaked murder in the language of law. The Holocaust in Poland. By 1940, the general government had become the beating heart of the Nazi project in the East. It was here, under Hans Frank's watch, that Hitler's vision of racial domination was transformed into industrial-scale murder. Poland was home to more than 3 million Jews. Too many to drive out, too many to ignore. At first, Frank's regime relied on starvation and humiliation, forcing Jews to wear white armbands marked with the Star of David, slashing food rations to a mere 200 calories per day. In Warsaw, his administration walled off 400,000 souls inside a ghetto that became an open-air prison. Hunger spread like fire. Corpses lay in the streets. By 1942, more than 100,000 had already died from deprivation alone. Then came the trains. Frank's officials organized the lists, the transports, the timetables. Day after day, cattle cars rolled eastward, packed with men, women, and children who would never return. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, names that would later become synonymous with horror, stood inside Frank's jurisdiction. Auschwitz-Birkenau lay just beyond his border, a world where smoke rose endlessly from chimneys. Together, these killing centers consumed over 3 million lives. Frank claimed later that he did not know. But the paper trail tells another story. His administration facilitated identification, detention, and deportation. He knew the ghettos were death traps. He knew the transports were one-way journeys. And still, he signed the orders. In 1942, a young resistance leader in the Warsaw Ghetto, Mordechai Anielewicz, led fighters who chose to resist deportation with pistols smuggled in by the Polish underground. They held out for weeks against the SS before being crushed. But their courage left a scar on Frank's rule. He had turned an ancient city into a graveyard, yet even there, life had dared to resist. By 1943, the tide of war had shifted. Stalingrad had fallen. The Red Army surged westward. And inside Poland, resistance grew bolder, fueled by the certainty that the Reich's empire was crumbling. Hans Frank, once untouchable in his Wawel Castle offices, now lived with the constant specter of defiance. The Polish underground hunted him, and in January 1944, a bomb ripped through the tracks beneath his train as he traveled east. The explosion derailed cars, tore metal apart, and left a trail of wreckage, but Frank stepped from the wreckage unscathed. Enraged, he ordered brutal reprisals, executing Polish prisoners in retaliation. Yet the assassin's failure was only a prelude. In August 1944, Warsaw erupted in open revolt. For 2 months, resistance fighters battled Nazi forces street by street. The uprising was crushed in blood, the city reduced to ruins, but the message was clear: Frank's reign was ending. By January 1945, Soviet tanks closed in on Krakow. Air raid sirens wailed as Frank packed his belongings and fled in a convoy of cars. He left behind offices littered with empty liquor bottles and stacks of incriminating documents, evidence of years of terror. He drifted back to Bavaria, stripped of authority, no longer the Governor-General, but a hollow figure clinging to a collapsing Reich. On the 4th of May 1945, American troops fresh from liberating Dachau found him in the small town of Tegernsee. The Butcher of Poland was finally in chains. The prison walls of Nuremberg were nothing like the ornate halls of Wawel Castle. Gone were the uniforms, the motorcades, the illusion of power. Hans Frank now sat in the dock with 20 other men, stripped of titles, facing judgment before the world. He was charged with conspiracy, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. At the start, he tried to present himself as contrite, declaring a terrible sense of guilt. He even converted to Catholicism, clutching a rosary as if faith could absolve him of the millions lost under his rule. Some observers believed his remorse was genuine. Others saw it as nothing more than a performance. Frank's defense was as hollow as the empire he had once served. He claimed he had not known about the extermination camps, that he had only carried out necessary measures of pacification, and that the SS acted beyond his control. But documents, testimonies, and the memories of survivors told a darker truth. His signature appeared on orders that starved ghettos, deported thousands, and facilitated the final solution. He knew. He always knew. Even his own son, Nicholas, would later say, "My father knew everything about the extermination camps." In October 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. When he heard the words, Frank whispered that he expected nothing less. Perhaps, at last, he realized that the law he once twisted to serve a dictator would now claim him as its final victim. The 16th of October, 1946, the gallows stood ready inside the execution chamber at Nuremberg. 10 Nazi leaders were scheduled to die that day, men who had once ruled Europe with iron fists, now reduced to prisoners awaiting the rope. Hans Frank was the fifth to ascend the wooden steps. Guards noted the unsettling calm on his face, and then the faintest trace of a smile, an expression so out of place it chilled the witnesses. His last words were simple. "I am grateful for the treatment received during my captivity and ask God to receive me with mercy." The trapdoor opened. The fall should have snapped his neck instantly. Instead, the drop was too short. The rope tightened, and Frank began to convulse violently, his body jerking and twisting. Minutes passed. 5, 8. Still he hung, gasping, strangled by the very instrument of justice. For 11 agonizing minutes, the man who had overseen starvation, deportations, and mass murder experienced his own slow descent into death. He was just 46 years old when his body finally fell still. Soon after, his remains were cremated, the ashes scattered in the Isar River. His empire of terror had dissolved into smoke and water. But the memory of his smile beneath the noose, the butcher of Poland, meeting justice not with defiance, but with eerie calm, would haunt history forever. The story of Hans Frank is more than the tale of a single man's fall. It is the story of how ambition, ideology, and loyalty to a dictator can corrupt a lawyer, the very guardian of law, into becoming the architect of slavery, starvation, and mass murder. From his childhood scarred by abandonment, to his rise in Hitler's shadow, to his rule over Poland drenched in blood, Frank's path was a descent into darkness that ended on the gallows. His final smile remains a mystery. Was it defiance, acceptance, or the last mask of a man who had lived his life behind masks of law and authority? 11 minutes of convulsions could never balance the millions of lives lost, but they stand as a grim reminder. Justice may be slow, imperfect, even cruel, but it comes. History warns us that men like Hans Frank are not born monsters. They are made through choices, through silence, through the surrender of conscience. And that is why remembering matters. So I ask you, which part of his story struck you the most? The boy abandoned by his mother, the governor drunk on power, or the condemned man smiling at death? Share your thoughts below, because in remembering, we keep history alive.